Good evening. I'm Josh Brumberg, the president of the CUNY Graduate Center, and it's my pleasure to welcome you back to the Graduate Center for tonight's program. Tonight's event, which is co-sponsored by the Stone Center on Socioeconomic Inequality and our public programs, is one of the first of our exciting fall lineup. Our public programs are an important part of our mission at New York City's only research-intensive public graduate school. Our events bring the learning from our labs and classrooms to the public, whether on stage or via our live stream. Here at the Graduate Student, we have over 3,200 doctoral and master's students studying in 48 different programs, from anthropology to urban education. Our faculty are world-renowned scholars and acclaimed authors and artists. We are proud to be an integral part of CUNY, the nation's largest urban public university. Tonight, an impressive panel of experts will shed light on a vexing issue that will impact voter behavior and ultimately the next 4 years. I am grateful for this timely event and look forward to a stimulating conversation. Before I announce introduce Leslie McCall, I want to point out at the end, I invite all of you to continue the conversation in our cafe for a beverage just on the other side of the lobby. We're trying that out tonight. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Leslie McCall, Presidential Professor of Sociology and Political Science and the Associate Director of the Stone Center on Socioeconomic Inequality, who helped organize this event and will introduce tonight's guests. Leslie?
Thanks very much, President Brumberg. And let me also welcome everyone here in the recital hall and also online. It's a great pleasure for us at the Stone Center to be co-hosting this evening's event. And on behalf of all of us involved in organizing this event, we thank you all very much for joining us. Before I introduce the topic and our guests, I'd like to first share some information about the format of the program tonight. The moderator and the panelists will converse among themselves until around 7:30. During that time, those of you in the audience here in the recital hall will have the opportunity to write questions on the index cards that were handed out earlier. The public program staff will begin collecting those cards at about 7:15, and then the cards will be sorted and handed to the moderator of tonight's event, which is Dr. Warren here. I'll introduce in a moment. Regarding the questions, we kindly ask you to make the questions relatively brief and to print as clearly as possible. And I've been told even to request that they be in block print, that you print in block print. And as an incentive, if you do those two things, it'll increase the chances of your question being selected tonight. Then starting at 7:30, our guests will address your questions for 15 minutes, and then we're going to close promptly at 7:45. Now to our program tonight. Against the backdrop of really horrific news over the past week, war, climate catastrophes, I could go on and on for a long time, and I know all of you are very familiar with what is going on in the world. The news about the economy, or at least the U.S. economy, stands out. By many accounts, the U.S. has witnessed a surprisingly rapid and strong recovery from the depths of the pandemic and from levels of inflation last seen nearly a half-century ago. The questions that tonight's guests will examine are, first, whether Americans share this rosy assessment of the economy. Second, if they do not, why not? What other factors might be weighing on their minds? And third, what all of this has to do with the upcoming election. The guests will be tackling these questions from both a short-term perspective, the much-debated Biden economic record, and from a longer-term perspective, discussing how people are grappling day to day with what still remains a vastly unequal and precarious economic status quo. So with that preview, let me turn to the introductions. We're honored tonight to have 4 remarkable guests. They've been thinking and researching and writing about these topics over many years and even decades. So in alphabetical order, I will start with Paul Krugman. He is a distinguished professor in the Graduate Center's PhD program in economics and a senior scholar at the Stone Center. Before joining the GC, he was professor of economics and international affairs at the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. He's received many honors, including, in 2008, the Nobel Prize for his work on international trade theory. He's the author of more than 200 articles in many books, most recently Arguing with Zombies, Economics, Politics, and the Fight for a Better Future. He also co-authors textbooks on micro and macroeconomics with Robin Wells, and you may know, in his spare time, he's a columnist for the New York Times. In fact, the idea for tonight's discussion came from those columns. Farah Stockman is a member of the New York Times editorial board, which she joined in 2020 after covering politics, social movements, and race for the paper's national desk. She previously spent 16 years at the Boston Globe, nearly half of that time as the paper's foreign policy reporter in Washington. She also served as a columnist and an editorial board member at the Globe, winning a Pulitzer in 2016 for her commentary on school desegregation in Boston. Her recent book, American Made: What Happens to People When Work Disappears, is an intimate account of the lives of 3 steelworkers whose Indiana plant moved to Mexico. And it's also a reflection on the roots of our current economic and political moment. Her reporting continues to probe the economic experiences of poor, working, and middle-class Americans, especially in the multiracial Midwest. Ernie Tedeschi is currently the Director of Economics at the Yale Budget Lab. A former member of the Biden administration, he was the chief economist at the White House Council of Economic Advisors. He previously served as an economist at the U.S. Department of the Treasury as well. Prior to the Council of Economic Advisors, he was managing director and head of fiscal analysis at Evercore ISI, which is a macroeconomics advisory firm. Ernie is widely considered a leading expert on the latest developments in the labor market, from wage and employment trends to worker and family responses to major pieces of federal and state legislation, including responses to the major pandemic spending packages at the federal level and to minimum wage increases at the state level. Lastly, tonight's moderator is Dorian Warren. He is co-president of Community Change and Community Change Action and co-founder of the Economic Security Project. Both positions have led Dorian to engage in conversations with communities throughout the country about the nature of economic insecurity in the U.S. today. Prior to his work in these capacities, Dorian taught for over a decade at the University of Chicago and Columbia University, where he was co-director of Columbia University's program on labor law and policy. He's the co-author of The Hidden Rules of Race, co-editor of Race and American Political Development, and author of numerous academic articles. Dorian previously worked as a guest host and contributor at MSNBC and has written for the New York Times, Newsweek, Ebony.com, among other outlets. So before I turn it over to Dr. Warren, a reminder that audience members here in the recital hall should jot down short, clearly written questions to be collected at around 7:10 to 7:15. So everyone, please join me in giving a very warm welcome and thank you to our guests tonight.
Thank you, President Brumberg and Professor McCall, and to our esteemed panelists. And I just want to take a minute or two to set up the conversation because as we sit here, we are 34 days until the presidential election. And the political scientist in me knows that there are a couple of things that are true, or at least that used to be true. One, there's a strong correlation between economic conditions and electoral outcomes, generally. 2, voters reward or punish incumbents based on the economy. 3, inflation and prices are top voter concerns. And last but not least, economic voting is what some scholars call retrospective, the old famous Ronald Reagan maxim, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? Based on objective economic indicators, we should be able to predict the outcome of the election in 34 days. And yet, we know it's basically a tie. And without going into detail, I think the big question and the big puzzle we want to walk around tonight is why are objective economic indicators so different from ordinary people's and from voters' subjective interpretations or perceptions? Or to put it another way, will the rising and strong stock market determine the outcome of the election, or is it the price of eggs and milk and gas and childcare and housing that people are feeling? Will that determine the outcome of the election? So, Ernie, I actually want to start with you because I want you to help us understand, just set the table for us in terms of what are the baseline economic indicators that we should put on the table for conversation, and what are the trend lines? Is it wages? Is it GDP? Tell us what they are.
So before the pandemic, if we were measuring consumer sentiment, so let's back up for a second. So there are two measures of consumer attitudes of the economy that we look at. One is called consumer sentiment, one is called consumer confidence. They're basically the same. They're asked in slightly different ways. For our purposes, they're basically the same because they're both down right now. Before the pandemic, as an economist, I would have made a model. And I could have explained 80 or 90% of consumer sentiment with four things: a measure of how easy it is to get a job, a measure of how strong wage growth is, a measure of how fast inflation is, and a measure of how fast the stock market is growing. So for how easy it is to get a job, the unemployment rate is probably the easiest thing to use. For wage growth, we have good data on that we get with the jobs report that comes out every month. Inflation, we have data on that come out every month. And then for the stock market, we use the S&P 500. You can use the Dow. You can use a lot of different things. I might have thrown in housing prices. Now, what's interesting, I know that there are probably a lot of young people in the audience. I can't see because the lights are in my eyes, but I'm assuming there are a lot of young people in the audience. I know that a lot of young people assume that when house prices go up, that will be a negative on sentiment because young people want to get into the housing market and house prices are a deterrent against young families getting into the housing market. And certainly for individuals, that is their reality and their truth. But remember that 2/3 of Americans are homeowners. So if you're one of the 2/3 of Americans who own a home, that is no longer a deterrent for you. That is now an asset, and you love higher home prices. So one of the most consistent findings in consumer sentiment is that when you put house prices into that model that I mentioned, it is consistently a positive coefficient. And by positive coefficient, I mean house prices go up, sentiment is stronger. Okay, so before the pandemic, those 4 or 5 things get you 80% of the way there. I'm sure you can think of lots of other things that if you were to answer these questions, you could throw into that model and they would be valid, and you can incrementally explain more and more, but that would get you most of the way there. So the pandemic happens. Unemployment shoots up, but then it comes rapidly back down. We're now at 4.2% unemployment. That's a very low level. Inflation, obviously, went up in 2022. It didn't go up immediately in the pandemic, but 2021 and then 2022, it was very high. But now it's almost back to the Fed's target of 2%. We're very nearly there. And the portion of inflation that is still hot is a portion of inflation that is probably not visible to most people. And I won't get into it, but it's basically something that's imputed by economists. So for all intents and purposes, inflation is back to normal in the experience of most people. The stock market has been doing extremely well throughout the pandemic. And wage growth has been between 3% and 4% in nominal terms. And by nominal terms, I mean not adjusting for inflation. So what you see on your actual paycheck. Those are all really strong numbers. And yet consumer sentiment is way below where we would expect it to be given the strength of all of those numbers right now. At least 20 to 30 points or 20 to 30% lower than we would expect it to be right now. Now, earlier in the pandemic, we might have chalked that up to, hey, COVID, and we have no experience with how to measure the effect of COVID on consumer sentiment, because the last time we had a pandemic this big was in 1918. But that's probably not true anymore, now in 2024. So it's got to be something else.
So Paul, I want to bring you in here and ask to follow up on Ernie's excellent setting the table here. How would you explain public sentiment on the economy writ large, and you've been writing about this, and on the president presiding over the economy, and are those two things associated?
Okay. Yeah, so actually, just want to follow up on I actually wrote down did a few numbers, which I think are worth. So there's an even a simpler, there's this old thing called the misery index, which is just the sum of unemployment and inflation. And first time I saw that, I said, that's stupid. But it turns out to actually do a pretty good job of explaining, or did do a pretty good job of explaining consumer sentiment, consumer confidence in the past. And if you looked, from 2000 to 2019, so 20 years before the pandemic, on average, the misery index was 8.1, it turns out. It's currently 6.7. So right now we are by the normal measure, is a good economy. Low unemployment, normal inflation, it's okay. The average Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index, which is the one everybody, so over that period was 86. As of last month, it was 67. So we have an economy that by the standard measures looks good, and people tell surveys that it's lousy. And then there's this big question, which are we missing something? Are people's lives actually, not just that do people have problems in their lives? Because people always have problems in their lives. There's even at times of roaring prosperity, there are always people who are suffering. But are we missing something that is, on average, making people worse off than the numbers say, or is it something else going on? And I go on and on. I go around in circles on this. I think it's actually quite hard to to make the case that people really are badly off. Certainly not that badly off. I mean, it's come up a little bit, but we had consumer sentiment not long ago that was comparable to the immediate aftermath of the financial crisis. We had consumer sentiment that was about as bad as it was in 1980 when we had double-digit inflation. Or to give you, I was going to go on a bit more, Morning in America. When Ronald Reagan said it's Morning in America and won a landslide victory, we had 7% unemployment and 4% inflation. And we now have 4% inflation, 4% unemployment and 2% inflation, and yet people think it's lousy. And it's really, really hard to say that objectively things are that bad. The one thing I would say that comes closest to a we'll have to get into the political stuff and maybe not quite that, but there are the reasons that people may be telling stories. We did have a burst of inflation, which came after a long period of low inflation. So we had a long period when people just didn't have to think about prices, and then we really had 2 years of high inflation, but which are now receding in the rearview mirror. But that certainly rattled everybody. Now I can say so. I'm rambling a bit, but give me a minute more here. Bloomberg had a story just a couple of days ago called "The End of the Cheap Burger," and it went on hamburger prices. And it said hamburger prices on average are up 18% since 2019. And a Big Mac is up 21%, and which is oh my God, And the gist of the story was that people can no longer afford hamburgers. Now Ernie knows, that wages, particularly if you take non-managerial workers, wages are up 29% since 2019. So actually, burgers are more, but that's not the way normal people think. Normal people don't link the two together. They feel that they earned their wage increases and they and that the price increases took it away from them. And we can come back to this a bit, because I'm not sure whether that's the story, but that's at least one way that it could be true.
So this is a great way to bring Farah in the conversation, because both of you, thank you, have given us some metrics, some quantitative indicators, like how do we measure the economy, what do people say on surveys. Farah, you talk to a lot of people in Indiana, in Michigan, and around the country, and I'm wondering if we've, in some ways, based on what you're hearing, have we misframed the conversation, or how would you intervene based on what you're hearing from people you talk to, especially in the heartland?
Well, yes, as the non-economist up here, I would say, just think about it. Where were we 4 years ago? 4 years ago, people were getting paid to stay home. And we saw this extraordinary period where Americans had money in the bank. Usually Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. That was the one period of time where they actually were able to bank money. They were getting paid for not working. And a lot of them, I've read something like 2/3 of them got more money to stay home than they had gotten to work. That's pretty good. That's a unicorn period of time. And they might miss it, right? They were better off 4 years ago because of that extraordinary period of time where they were getting lots of money for not actually working. And when that came to an end, I mean, why shouldn't they be grumpy about that? I think that's one possibility. Another possibility is that social media allows us to see how other people are living and what they're able to afford in a way that we have never seen before. You're peering into people's lives and seeing what they can, what's in their closet, what they're buying. And it's just like the keeping up with the Joneses is on steroids. And so just like even like the cost of like going to a baseball game or going to a concert, like it's really expensive to do the things that you're seeing people do all the time on social media, the people you follow. And I think that we haven't also factored in the great unhappiness that is caused by being able to peer into people's lives and see how they live or how they want us to think they're living. I think that's part of it that's new. Anyway.
Okay, can I follow up on that to all three of you then? So, so the cash that we all got, actually, first in 2020 and then continued in 2021. I think there were 3 economic stimulus papers, 3 payments, 3 stimmies. There was expanded child tax credit, which helped reduce child poverty to its lowest level in American history. That was basically cash monthly in parents' pockets. Counterfactuals are really hard to tell. Because you could tell a story, well, if we didn't have that incredible government intervention, the misery index would have been, right? We would have been in Great Depression levels, potentially. So why? Okay, people miss the money. I got that part. But for 40 or some odd years, maybe longer, we've had this relationship between how people credit, say, politicians, I'm not going to be partisan here, how people credit those in power with the economy. And you're suggesting something is fundamentally different in this post-pandemic era. Why is that?
So I think one difference is, unemployment when it hits the economy, even at its worst, only hits a small segment of the population. And I don't mean that to sound callous. Statistically, so at the worst point in the pandemic, and remember, at the height of the pandemic in April of 2020, we reached the highest unemployment rate that we had reached since the Great Depression, and that was 15%. And in fact, we probably mismeasured it. In fact, it was probably more like 20%. That meant that that means that of the people who wanted a job, 80% could get a job or had a job at the time. Right? Whereas when you talk about 9% inflation, everybody is seeing 9% increase in prices on average across the prices. So it pinches everybody. So I think that's one thing. I think the social media aspect of it is absolutely something that's different than in the past. And remember that social media is asymmetric, by which I mean it's one-sided. I used to yell at our social media team in the administration about this. People would post, receipts of, expensive McDonald's meals that they got, and it turned out that they would get them like at airports or truck stop, like places where McDonald's is by its nature expensive. Like, of course a Big Mac is $15 at an airport. It's an airport. They're complaining on social media because they're complaining on social media. That's what social media is for. People don't post their good deals on social media. Like, that's not what social media is for. I'm sorry. So, like, I would yell at, like, White House social media at these 25-year-olds. I'd be like, you got to post low receipts on White House social media. And they'd be like, no, we can't do that. We're not going to do that. And I'd be like, I'm old. Like, come on. Like, think a little bit more creatively. Anyway, so, yeah, no. So I agree that that's something else that's different than in the past, and then just finally on the stimulus payments like this, and on the child tax credit, I think the child tax credit in particular was something that vexed us in the administration because we were so proud in the administration of the fact that we cut child poverty nearly in half. And, it was one of our greatest disappointments that we were not able to pass that, but we kept looking in the sentiment data among parents in particular, like, do we see signs of this? And I think what we concluded in the end was that parents at the time just thought it was another stimulus check, that they had no expectation that this was a permanent program that was yanked away from them, that they were like, oh, this is just like one of those other checks, but I'm just getting it for my kid, So it was a real lesson in policy framing and policy expectations for us.
Okay, yeah. There's a bunch of themes running here that, and it's an interesting question. Farah, I would like to actually know whether people were unaware of how the 1% lived, sort of before social media. Are really people more, and also for in America at least, there's always a little bit of a mixture of admiration as opposed to resentment, lifestyles of the rich and famous kind of thing. But I wonder if that's really, it's possible. It's certainly true what Ernie's saying. What circulates on social media is constant horror stories about crazy prices, which turn out to be crazy. I can't resist. Favorite example, Kyle Bass, the investor, put up his $85 room service breakfast. And it did get community noted that, first of all, he was at a hotel where rooms were up to $9,000 a night. And secondly, I was just struck, what does a man who can afford anything have for breakfast? And the answer was Diet Coke, bacon, and waffles. And that's why, oh gosh. But in fact, that's been one of my preoccupations. I've probably written about it too many times. Is that social media is full of stories about prices that basically say that inflation is much, much higher than the official numbers say. But we can check that. There's enough independent sources, and it turns out that no, actually, certainly on food prices, the official numbers are right on. But I don't know that it may be that social media definitely makes it possible to complain and for complaints to go viral in a way that wasn't there before. But it's also I really do think I continue to come back at least partially to the just the shock of having had an episode of inflation. So, Morning America, if you actually look at this point in Reagan's first term, consumer prices had risen by just about the same amount they have at this point in Biden's term. But that was after a long period of inflation. So people were not shocked by it happening, and instead they were focused on the fact that inflation had come down, although it was still 4%. This time it came as a big shock to the system. And so we may, and this is a problem, by the way, you try and do a regression on past consumer sentiment, and the trouble is that history moves on, and we may not be in the same world. So that is certainly part of the story. And then I do want to get into this, but maybe we want to get a little bit further, but there's some question about whether people, at least some of the evidence suggests that people say the economy is lousy, but I'm okay. Right. And that and there's certainly also, and we'll get into this, that the partisan effects on consumer sentiment are extreme. So there's something going on here. It's not, I don't think that, I think that the economy is good, in fact, by historical standards. The trouble is, good by historical standards, America, there's always a lot of people suffering. We're a rich country, but a very unequal one. And so, but I think that something else is going on, and it's partly the shock of inflation, but it's partly something else is going on.
I mean, I appreciate the fact we're in the land of facts, haha, and facts matter. And Farah, I'm wondering, what are the vibes that you're hearing from people? Because those aren't the same thing, and vibes can have just as much power and influence over how people make meaning of their own lives or of the political situation than objective economic facts. So help us, why are the economists wrong?
Well, I'm not hearing people say that the economy is bad, but I'm okay. I'm hearing people say, I'm suffering. I'm hearing a lot of people say that they're suffering. Even people in my immediate circle are saying it. And so I have to take issue with some of the metrics that we're using. I mean, unemployment is low. Of course it's low. Everyone has to work like 3 jobs just to make rent. I've been spending a lot of time in Detroit, and every one of my, close associates there, cousins, relatives, they all work 3 jobs. They work, a side hustle and a side hustle. Like people work from 9 to 5, and then they have a job at night. Or they work 5 days a week, and then they have a weekend job. They never see their kids. These are not people who are just talking about vibes. People are living off credit card debt. And that's how they're making ends meet, by racking up debt that they have no hope of ever repaying. Stock market. Of course the stock market is high when we have such, concentration of corporations that the industries are able to collude and keep prices high.
Like
and
chicken.
Like chicken, right? The chicken industry has so few chicken processors, this is something I just wrote about, that the executives are able to get together and decide how to keep these COVID prices, how to keep them high and how to keep wages low. The people in the state of Washington, this is not a crazy conspiracy theory. People of Washington State are actually getting checks right now because their attorney general won a price-fixing case on chicken and on tuna, right? So I'm just saying that, Pilgrim's Pride, their stock went up from $20 a share 10 years ago. Today it's $47. Should we be celebrating if we know how they got there? If the way they got there was to keep wages low and to collude on prices or whatnot. It's not good for chickens. It's not good for people who eat chickens. It's not good for chicken farmers. The stock market is a very poor indicator for how most Americans are doing. I think 60% of Black Americans don't own stock, and I think maybe 93% of stocks are held by 10% of people. It isn't a good indicator for how most of us are doing. And in a country that is, has essentially an oligarchy in some of these industries, them doing well might mean the rest of us not doing so great. So I'm just putting that out there as a possibility. I'm not an economist, but I'm putting it out there as a possibility.
I'm not an economist either, but I'm going to pretend like I am one. So the question to what Farah just said gets at what else are we missing here? So let me give you a quick, you just mentioned partisanship, so let me give you a quick example on that. I talked to lots of voters around the country, in particular lots of black voters. And if in some of our focus groups, say in April, most of them, partisanship, strong Democrats, they would have said, we're riding with Biden. They also would have said, oh, the Biden administration, sorry, Ernie, my life hasn't changed much. And then you press a little bit and say, but okay, if this was, say, October 2021, what was that period in your life? And are you better off today than you were in October 2021? They would have been like, yeah, I'm better, but it still kind of sucks. So the partisanship thing, I'm dubious about, Paul. No one's mentioned misinformation or disinformation, so I want to put that on the table. And then I want to put on the other thing I hear from voters that I work with, because I don't know if the metrics, the economic indicators capture all the things. So childcare costs, for instance. Like childcare costs are through the roof. I live in DC, it's like the most expensive childcare market. It's crazy. So what else are we missing here based on what Farah's hearing, but what you're seeing in the data? Why is there this disjuncture?
You want to go?
Well, yeah, a word about the stock market. As far as I know, nobody in the Biden administration has ever boasted about the stock market. I don't know any serious economist who thinks that the stock market is a measure of the success of the economy. The only sort of prominent figure I've ever heard boast a lot about the stock market or talk about the stock market as a measure of success is Donald Trump. So it's kind of strange, right? So this is and yet people. And by the way, it's also true that many people say that they were better off pre-pandemic when there were no stimulus checks. So there's something else going on beyond that, although the one thing always is that people, how much, do you remember what you were earning in 2019? I don't. Do you remember what things cost in 2019? Actually, I don't. Nobody, I think very few people really have a sense of that. And by the way, sorry, continuing that thought just a minute, everything that you were saying about people working multiple jobs, credit card debt, all of that was as true in 2019 as it is now. So why were people so more optimistic? And on the partisanship thing, we do know, we know what the surveys tell us. And the surveys show enormous partisan effects, that people who self-identified Republicans were extremely high on the economy in late 2019. Still fairly high through much of 2020, despite the fact that we were ravaged by the pandemic, became extremely negative as soon as the White House changed hands. Democrats do the same thing, but not to the same extent. So the economy right now looks about like the economy just on the eve of the pandemic. Democrats, according to Michigan, are slightly more positive on the economy now than they were when Trump was president, and the economy looks similar, but it's a much smaller effect. So there's an independents are in between, and that's because there aren't any independents. Leslie is here somewhere, right? Most people who say they're independents are actually Democrats or Republicans. So what you're looking at is an average. I think the partisanship thing is important because it does tell us that what people say about the economy may not correspond very much to their own experience. Because it cannot be true that life suddenly got much worse for Republicans when Biden took office and suddenly got better for Democrats, right? And then we have this problem. I still haven't heard what we're missing. Not that there isn't always a lot of stress, but what is different now? Occupy, you mentioned, Occupy took place that all these issues about inequality, people struggling was out there, but consumer sentiment was a lot higher when all of that was taking place. So what is going on?
Ernie?
I think the other problem is that when there are multiple issues in the economy that people have to pay attention to, it crowds out the good stuff. So one great measure in the University of Michigan survey that we've been talking about is one of the questions they ask when you dig down to the data is, have you heard good news about X? Have you heard good news about, inflation? Have you heard good news about employment? So a really cool thing that you can do is you can make a graph of, have you heard good news about employment or hiring? And you can plot that against the unemployment rate. And you can see and they also ask, have you heard bad news about employment? And so what we can do is we can plot, number of people that have heard good news minus number of people that have heard bad news. We can call that net number of, people that have heard good news. So in 2018 and 2019, when the unemployment rate was 3.5%, the net good news people hearing, good news about employment was positive 10 percentage points. That is about 10% more people were hearing good news about employment versus bad news about employment. In 2023, when the unemployment rate was that same, 3.5%, and job growth was the same pace, actually a little bit stronger than it was in 2018 and 2019, that balance flipped to negative 10%. Now, one might say it's because maybe the media has a negativity bias, and I can give you an example in a minute of that, where I think that was the case. But I think that might be a little too pat an answer. I think that when so much is going on in the economy, like inflation, I think that it can crowd out good news as well. It can crowd out, it can push good employment news off of the front page. We were in a full employment economy in 2023 by every metric as good as it was in 2019. Now, everybody has their own truth. Like I said before, were there people who had to work multiple jobs? Absolutely. Were there people who struggle in this economy, who have to work gig economy jobs? Absolutely. On average, though, the situation in 2023 was the same that it was in 2019. And I remember the headlines in 2018 and 2019. They were good. They were celebratory of our labor market. They were not nearly as celebratory in 2023 by a long shot. And let me give you a very vivid example to me. And by the way, even though I was in the Biden administration, and the Biden administration loved to complain about coverage of inflation, I used to tell people internally, I was like, look, this is the highest inflation that we've had since the early 1980s. Of course the media is going to cover it. This is a real kitchen table issue. What do you expect them to do? Not talk about inflation? The media has to cover this. I think for me, the bigger disappointment was undercovering the strong job growth that we were seeing in 2021, 2022, 2023. And the most vivid example of this, and I'm sorry that this is from the New York Times, but I've said this to the face of the journalists who did this, so I'm not saying anything I haven't said to them individually. The September 2023 jobs report that we got in October 2023, I think the market was expecting that we add somewhere around 200,000 jobs that month. We ended up adding 380,000 jobs that month. It was a big surprise, a big positive surprise. I think we added almost double the number of jobs that we expected that much. It should have been a big celebratory deal. There were 4 headlines on the front page of the New York Times Every single one of them was negative about the report. And they were negative from an inflationary standpoint. And without getting into like the nitty-gritty economics of it, because there was, a lot of anxiety about what the Federal Reserve would do, the reason to have been nervous was whether wage growth was too hot. Because there's this, there's a worry about if wage growth is too hot, that it'll be inflationary. Well, wage growth in that report was not too hot. It was pretty modest, actually. So you got strong jobs growth, pretty modest wage growth, and yet every single one of those headlines was negative. I think that plays a little bit of a role in this too.
I just want to say, and I know we're going to be running out of time very soon, so people don't experience the economy. People experience their own lives. They have some vision of what's happening around them, and then the rest they pick up from news media, social media. In a lot of ways, views about the economy, I think, are like views about crime, and which famously, we had an epic decline in crime from the early 1990s till about 2015, and all through that period, people said crime is getting worse. All through it, and people currently, and this is again a standard thing. If you ask people, now you can't ask how's crime going for you, because that's people. It's like we have two measures of overall crime, one of which is based on victimization reports, and those victimization reports somehow do not track homicides, because the victims of homicide don't usually answer surveys. But if you ask people, how is crime a big problem nationally, they say yes. If you ask, is crime a big problem in your neighborhood, or where you live, they say no. Much of America believes that if you step out this building, you'll be mugged and raped in a second, that New York is this urban hellscape, which is amazing, because it's actually, I guess Boston has just become even safer than New York, but the lowest murder rates in the country are here and there. And that's to the extent we have available surveys, and again, this is not talking to people, so there's this abstractness. People are kind of okay about their financial situation, not all of them, but on average. The people are relatively positive about their local economy and extremely negative about the national economy. What do any of us know about what's actually going on in the mountains of North Carolina, right? No, we're not there. But there's a lot of stories out there saying that people have been abandoned. Now, I happen to know, because I'm following, reading the New York Times, that there's actually a massive relief effort underway. But if you're getting your news from sources that prefer to tell you that they've been abandoned because we're spending the money on, depending on your politics, Israel or Ukraine, that's what you're going to believe. And I think there's a lot of that going on, unfortunately, on the economy.
So we're definitely going to take your questions. If you haven't written a question, write it right now. You have like 2 minutes, because I want to ask this final question to all of you. Maybe it's a two-part question. The first part, and I'll start with you, Farah. Several people have written about the death of deliverism, meaning deliverism. Just because you deliver as a politician or an administration, Ernie, just because you deliver public goods or cash or industrial policy that creates lots of new jobs, it doesn't translate into political support or votes. So like delivering on shit doesn't work. Doesn't say you shouldn't do it, it's the right thing to do, but just because you gave out cash, just because you gave free COVID shots and free COVID tests, just because you are literally creating new jobs in a whole bunch of regions in the South and in the Midwest that you've written about what happens when work disappears, there's a lot of new construction people can see of new factories and plants to make chips for our phones and devices. It's not like people don't see this. They see a factory being built. There's also, I have to say this, like an upsurge in workers organizing and trying to organize in these new jobs. So I just want to try one more time. What is going on here? Like, how does this not land with people? And what really, like, do people not see the new factories, Farah, in these places?
So, by the way, my earlier comments about monopolies, and I was not faulting the Biden administration, which has done more to confront monopolies than any in generations. So, but I do think there is a sense that the economy is out of our control, that there is a small group of people controlling things at the top, that inequality is so great that those who have the most are rigging it for everyone, and it's pervasive in our, and it's kind of not, it's not wrong.
I would say it's not, but people aren't wrong about that.
It's actually not wrong, right? I think that the other thing you hear is that when there's a lot of money getting thrown around to build things, to go into green energy, you know, if I'm not getting that money, right? If I'm not the one personally getting it, you know, there's jealousy. I think there's some of that, or those are my tax dollars that you're spending, and you're giving it away to someone you chose and someone you like to, you know, increase your election chances.
Someone who doesn't look like me.
Maybe like that. There might be some of that. So I think it's complicated. And I also think Democrats if you believe that government should be working and should do things, the bar is higher for you to actually to do a great job, and you're not going to hit it out the park. So I think they threw a lot of spaghetti at the wall, and you know, I'm hoping that in a few years we're going to see more of the outcome. But I think some of that money, like the incredible money that's come through with the IRA and all that stuff, it hasn't actually sunk in. A lot, some of it hasn't actually even been spent. And so I think part of the disconnect is that on the ground, it looks different. You've heard all this money's been spent, but a lot of it's still in the pipeline. So that's one thing.
So you're partly arguing there's a lag effect. So if we're having this conversation in 2030, people might have different interpretations of what happened in 2021 and 22 and 23 and change their minds about what they lived through. Maybe.
So I've never heard that word before, deliverism, but I get it, and I agree with it. I agree with you. The third rail of American politics is Social Security.
Right.
And I think that the reason why it's the third rail of American politics is not just because, you know, first FDR and then subsequent Democrats created a program that gave money to seniors. It's because they created a system that Americans thought was fair and that they accepted as a new social contract. You pay in, you get something back at the end. And everybody, you know, it's basically fair, everybody basically participates. Now, you study it and you realize, well, you're not really saving, it's really more of a pay-as-you-go system. But, you know, the fiction of Social Security, people accept that bedtime story as the way the system should work, right? And that's why people like it and why people fight to preserve it. I
have to, because I'm a political scientist, so I just have to add, there's another piece that's really important here, Ernie. Sometimes policies create new constituencies. And so there's no AARP before Social Security.
Yeah, 100%.
There is a robust institution of millions of people who are very active in civil society who will defend that program they benefit from,
no. And
go to the polls around it.
Medicare it feeds into that too. No, exactly. And, exactly. I think that, so I'll be perfectly honest. I think that the Biden administration gets high points for the economics of what we did. I think that we have a lot to think about and reflect on with the public economics, or the public, for lack of a better word, public relations of those programs. We did not create a system with the CTC, in large part because it only lasted for a year. The stimulus checks were one time. The UI payments, while, absolutely the right thing to do and strictly necessary, we would have to think, we would have to think about again, particularly if we were in a situation where there wasn't, God help us, that we don't go through another pandemic, right, where we have to pay people not to work like that again. It was, and I'm not even just talking about salesmanship here, because, politicians, when people don't like their policies, always say, oh, it was bad salesmanship. Like, if only, we had like a slicker presentation, like people would have liked it. I'm not saying it's just that. I think that there's, I really do think that we have to, as we reflect on the good and the bad things that happened in the pandemic, and I think that, again, we had a lot of policy successes here. The United States was by far, had the strongest recovery of any rich nation in the world. We had the strongest pandemic recovery. I think the second strongest recovery was Canada, which had half of our economic growth over the course of the pandemic. And we had middle of the road inflation. And I know that normal people don't care about that. Like the average person in Ohio, who cares, like what other countries did. But as a metric that economists face, that to me says that we must have done a lot of things right at a macro level, right? And so to the extent that people on the ground are not feeling it or don't like it, it means that, we need to sort of go back to the drawing board and think about, okay, we got some of the big picture stuff right, but we need to think more about, fundamentally, what is the social contract here? How are we talking about this with people?
Oh, there's so much I'd like to say, and we don't have time. Just to say that Nancy Pelosi's infamous, always taken out of context remark about we'll have to pass Obamacare for people to understand what's in it, was really saying it will take a while for people to appreciate what we've done, which they now do. Right. But it took a long time.
10 years from the beginning of enrollment to now.
Yeah. I just want to say one thing, that we were, I don't know if I'm repeating myself now, but if this Michigan survey, which is everybody's go-to, and I'm not sure that it's actually ideal, but whatever. It does, in addition to everything else, it does now ask, which candidate do you think will be better for the economy? And the most recent couple of surveys have said, by a small margin, Harris. So despite all of this and the griping and the pessimism, it's actually, at the other surveys give Trump an edge, but not nearly as much. So despite all of this, it looks as if people say the economy is horrible and I hate the job that they've been doing. And by the way, let's keep this administration in power.
Thank you to Ernie Tedeschi, Paul Krugman, Farah Stockman.